I'm McDonald-Crowley. I was one of the members of the transmediale jury for the festival this year, along with Misha Bielicki, Masaki Fujihata, Gunalan Nadarajan and Christiana Paul. This morning, or this afternoon, we're going to be having artist presentations by the artists who've been shortlisted for the awards for this year's festival. The awards ceremony will be held on Monday night, so we're all still holding our breath for that. We're going to be doing the sessions in 3 lots of 3 artists, so we'll take a 5-minute break at the end of each hour. The first group of artists that we have speaking with us this morning are Niklas Roy, who's going to talk about his project Pong Mechanic, Michelle Teran, who will talk about her project Life, a User's Manual, and the tour that she did yesterday around the city of Berlin, and Usman Haque talking about Sky Ear, the work that was presented at the opening night of the festival. This year, for the first time, we actually did not have art form categories for the festival's jury selection, which was a bit of a challenge for us, but it was also very exciting to see the breadth of work that artists are presenting and to talk about new media art practices in a broader way, to see how we can break down the categories and how we can assess work. But to kick off this morning's session, I'd like to introduce Niklas Roy.
Yeah, hello, I'm Niklas, and I've made the work Pong Mechanic, and I'd like to talk about reality, computer-generated reality, and about tennis right now. First of all computer games are based on computer-generated worlds. A copy of reality is calculated inside the computer, and if the developers of the game want that, the result is a more or less successful audiovisual representation of our real world. In most cases, senses which are beyond seeing and hearing are ignored. But if they are not ignored, they're usually supported in a ridiculous way. Think of rumble packs, for example, where you get a tactile feedback of an event which feels like a vibrating telephone, and it's got nothing to do with the gameplay. It's the aim of many video games to make the auditory and the visual quality so good that, for example, a computer tennis game reaches a TV broadcast of a real tennis game. And if you think of the earliest computer tennis games, which were just black and white and where the pixels were as big as thumbnails, and where you needed a lot of fantasy to find out that you were actually playing a tennis game, the question is, where does this development lead to? Of course, a tennis game which looks like a TV broadcast of a real tennis game can't be the end. So maybe if you play next generation computer games, the immersion will be so strong that there is no difference anymore between standing on a real tennis court and playing a computer tennis game. If this ever happens, then I should ask myself if it wouldn't be easier to play tennis in reality. My work Pong Mechanic was an experiment where I wanted to find out more about the subject. And what I've done was to turn the whole thing around and build an absolutely real game as a one-to-one copy of a computer game. The following film will explain the work, and if you want to, you can try it out later, downstairs after this presentation. And now we see the film. Hopefully.
DLB Broadcast und BC Entertainment zeigen Almut Dietz-Felbinger und Vincent de Blü an einem Spiel, das ich gebaut habe. Pong-Mechanik ist eine elektromechanische Variante des Videospielklassikers Pong. Die Interface-Elemente sind mit denen des gewohnten Pong identisch. Das Spiel wird von 2 Spielern mit jeweils einem Joystick bedient. Auch die Anzeige entspricht dem herkömmlichen Pong. Jeder Spieler steuert einen Schläger, der als breiter weißer Strich auf schwarzem Untergrund angezeigt wird. Mit diesem Schläger wird ein weißes Quadrat, der Ball, hin und her geschlagen. Trifft ein Spieler den auf ihn zukommenden Ball nicht, bekommt der andere Spieler einen Punkt. Die Punkte werden oben in der Mitte des Spielfelds angezeigt. Jeder Kontakt des Balls mit dem Schläger oder der Bande wird akustisch mit einem oder unterstrichen. Nolan Bushnell, einer der Gründer von Atari, baute 1972 das erste Pong. Bei dem ursprünglichen Spiel wurde das Bild auf einem Fernseher angezeigt. Obwohl das Bild bei Pong-Mechanik genauso aussieht, wird es vollkommen anders hergestellt. Das Display besteht aus zwei in geringem Abstand übereinander liegenden Glasplatten. Zwischen den Glasplatten bewegt sich der Kunststoffball, der von zwei Schnüren geführt wird. Oberhalb der Glasplatten befinden sich die Schläger, zwei weiße Kunststoffrechtecke, die auch mit Schnüren bewegt werden. Die untere der beiden Glasplatten ist mit dem Spielfeld bemalt. Unter den Glasplatten sind zwei Drehscheiben befestigt, die den Punktestand durch zwei Fenster im Spielfeld anzeigen. Unterhalb der Glasplatten findet das eigentliche Spiel statt. Jedes bewegliche Teil, also Schläger und Ball, sind durch Schnüre mit einem Gegenstück auf der Unterseite verbunden. Sehen wir uns Vincents Schläger doch einmal genauer an. Die Schnur führt über Umlenkrollen zu einem Wagen, der durch einen Elektromotor auf einer Schiene hin und her bewegt wird. Vincent steuert diesen Elektromotor mit seinem Joystick. Der Wagen hat 3 Kupferkontakte. Wenn das mechanische Gegenstück des Balls einen dieser Kontakte berührt, wird der Ball zurückgeschlagen. Die beiden äußeren Kontakte schlagen den Ball schräg zurück und wenn er ihn mit der mittleren Kupferplatte trifft, wird der Ball gerade zurückgeschlagen. Im Gegensatz zu den Schlägern muss sich der Ball in 2 Achsen bewegen können. Der Wagen des Balls fährt also auf einer Schiene und diese Schiene hängt wiederum in einem Rahmen, der sich hin und her bewegt. Die beiden Motoren des Balls werden von einem Relaiscomputer gesteuert. Dazu später mehr. Zunächst ist erst einmal wichtig, dass der Ball einen Kontakt hat. Und trifft der Kontakt auf eine der Kupferplatten eines Schlägers, dann wird die Drehrichtung seines Motors umgedreht und der Ball wird zurückgeschlagen. Trifft der Ballkontakt allerdings eine der Stangen hinter den Schlägern, dann bekommt der andere Spieler einen Punkt und die beiden Schläger fahren zurück in ihre Ausgangsposition. Die Punkte werden, wie schon erwähnt, mit 2 Drehscheiben angezeigt. Unter den Drehscheiben befinden sich Kontakte, die dem Steuercomputer mitteilen, wie die Punkte gerade stehen. Wenn einer der Spieler 5 Punkte erreicht hat, stellen sich die Scheiben auf 0 Punkte zurück und ein neues Spiel kann beginnen. Um zu verstehen, wie der Sound erzeugt wird, bauen Vincent und ich das Spiel am besten einmal schnell auseinander. Neben dem Relaiscomputer sind 2 Klanghölzer angebracht und 2 Elektromagneten schlagen die beiden Hölzer an. Wenn schon alles so offen ist, werfen wir doch auch einen Blick auf den Relaiscomputer. Der Computer ist das Herzstück des Spiels. Hier gehen alle Informationen der Joysticks und der Kontakte ein. Daraufhin schaltet der Computer die Elektromotoren für die Spiel- und für die Punkteanzeige sowie die Elektromagneten auf den Klanghölzern. Statt mit modernen Halbleitern und Mikroprozessoren arbeitet der Computer mit Telefonrelais, einer Technik, die noch aus der Anfangszeit der elektronischen Datenverarbeitung stammt. Konrad Zuse, Digitalpionier und Erfinder des Computers, baute in den 30er Jahren des 20. Jahrhunderts erste Rechenmaschinen aus ebensolchen Relais auf. Sehen wir uns ein solches Telefonrelais doch einmal etwas genauer an.
Das ist ein Relais. Das Relais dient dazu, hier unten Stromschläge zu erzeugen. Wie bedient man es? Es ist ganz einfach. Hier sind Zahlen angegeben. Die erste Zahl ist für uns die entscheidende. Hier steht die 300. So, wir drücken jetzt diese 2 Pforten 300 Mal ganz schnell zusammen.
Na, Almut, das war jetzt aber nicht ganz korrekt. Tatsächlich besteht ein Relais aus einer Spule und wenn durch diese Spule Strom fließt, wird ihr Eisenkern magnetisch. Der magnetische Kern schließt daraufhin einen Schalter. Mit einem Relais kann man also mit einem Stromkreis einen anderen Stromkreis schalten. Solche Relais wurden früher unter anderem verwendet, um Telefongespräche zu vermitteln. Daher auch der Name Telefonrelais. Dieser kleine Film hat nun sein Ende gefunden und ich hoffe, ihr habt verstanden, was in der Maschine vor sich geht, wenn Almut und Vincent Pongmechanik spielen.
Thanks very much, Niklas. I have to say the jury really loved the kind of analog digital play that you had going with Pongmechanik. Now, we're going to have three speakers talk first, and then we'll field questions from the audience. So if Michelle Teran is the next speaker, if you'd like to talk about your project Life, a User's Manual.
Okay. Hello, good morning, everybody. Life of User's Manual is a series of public performances and online mappings that explore the hidden spaces and stories as captured by private wireless CCTV streams and how they intersect with the visible world around us. I'm just going to run this movie in the background. Before I get into some concepts of it, around it, I'd like to show you what I'm working with. This is a receiver. It's a very sort of basic electronic device that you can find in your standard, any place that you might find consumer electronics like televisions and VCRs, etc. It is transmitting on one of the few sort of parts of the radio spectrum that is allocated for public use, specifically called the ISM band, and this electronics, along with things that are running on Bluetooth and also Wi-Fi 802.11v, are running on a frequency called 2.4 gigahertz. So you don't need a broadcaster's license to purchase and also run one of these. It's mostly used by private consumers for security. It's a low-power transmitter, and because it's a low-power transmitter, you don't have to have a broadcaster's license, so it doesn't transmit very far. And it sort of is divided over 4 channels, and it has some connectors here, one for video and 2 channels of audio. So what it does is, this is giving a wireless transmission through this a very simple use of these devices. This is the receiver, actually, and you have a camera and transmitter on the other end. So it's the transmitter, and then this grabs the image and the audio. So it's what it gives is you have a wireless transmission that has a very specific geographical location. This is how I'm grabbing images out of the air. So I'm using a readily available equipment, but I'm changing the context of how it is used. This is image of the first camera that I found. It's actually in Berlin, so I'm actually coming back full circle. It was in 2002, and it was in October, sorry. This is the first, within the first 3 hours that I had arrived in Berlin. This was my first time in Berlin. Opened up the receiver and discovered this silently watched elevator shaft, elevator door. I was walking with a friend of mine, and she was grabbing the images of the street. As we walked closer to the source of the image started to get clearer. The silence of this, and silence and stillness of the watched doorway was a stark contrast to the lively actions of people on the street, since it was a Saturday night. People were just coming out of the movie. The stillness of the elevator was briefly interrupted by 2 women that entered briefly and then quickly exited. You might have seen that already. I've continued these walks across 3 continents and cities, specifically Chicago, Montreal, Hobart, Berlin, Amsterdam, Ghent, Brussels, Basel, and Utrecht. With the wireless transmissions, what happens with wireless transmissions I've discovered, or what I'm observing, is that It's creating an ad hoc, invisible network of personal fragments and stories that are overlaid upon private and public social spaces, such as the cafe, the apartment building, the store, the parking lot, the office, and the street. It's a situation where the technological network meets the social network and the physical media spaces intersect. As an artist, I'm really interested in this ambiguous state, in looking at the interstices between the physical and the mediated. And I'm questioning what it means to inhabit a space. Is it by being physically present and therefore affecting it, or understanding what the space is by its contents and therefore mentally moving through it, or somewhere in between? The question is not why the camera is there. That's very apparent. The camera is there is because somebody cares about something enough to watch it. The question for me is what the camera is looking at. And the answer to this varies. The diversity of images communicates that. And at the same time, the images are common. We're talking archetypal spaces filled with social rituals and codes. Sorry. So in this work, my role in this work is physical interface to the unseen, peeling the layer back, lifting a veil, and leaving it up to the observers or participants to question and then evaluate what they are seeing. So I'm going to show two ways that I'm dealing with this. One is the participatory walks. I've carried this out in a few cities. This is Utrecht. In this case, participants are given scanning and recording devices, and they walk through the city with me. It's a shared activity of mapping the city, and what I found is the action is a social action. And the act of walking and while you're engaging in this activity becomes a catalyst for conversations and observations about what is happening, and it results in a multi-layered discussion about what is public, what is private, control or lack of, memory, and how we perceive and inhabit space. I open up the possibility for improvisation, and it's led by whomever is walking with me. A lot of people that are walking with me have the desire to find the source of the camera, and that leads to a number of improvisations and actions where they go and approach and interview mostly shop owners, and in this way get to know how much they know about the technology that they currently own and are operating. For example, this is a shoe owner that when he was approached and said, well, do you know that we can pick up your camera? He said, yes, of course, I know that because the video shop owner across the street, he installed a camera and I could see his video store on my monitor. So these are a number of images of videos that we take, and also photographs that people are taking while we are on the walks. And these images and the conversations are translated into online maps that become collages of surveillance footage, images from the street, and also the different types of conversations. And again, I'm interested in the multi-tangential conversations that arise. The second type of performance that I do is where I am assuming the role of a mobilized persona. The mobilized persona is acting as a guide or an entrance to a scene. The persona is an urban presence who, by her very presence or continuous presence in urban space, becomes attuned to another level of information that is there but not seen. She's a clairvoyant, she's a voyeur, she's a nomad, she's a drifter, she's a migrant. She assumes many forms, and she is a physical interface to the unseen. Here's the two personas from two walks, one that happened in Brussels, and the second one just yesterday happened in Prenzlauer Berg in Berlin. And I've just been told that the documentation from this performance is now part of the installation in the foyer. In this performance, I have a mobile visual display on wheels the character places herself between the physical and the mediated, and looks at the qualities of time and space within these interstices by creating a series of composed moments and tableau. I have this last persona that I developed for the Berlin Walk is inspired by a character in Fassbinder's 1969 film Gods of the Pest, Carla, a Laulo, peddler, informant, ubiquitous presence, exchanging information via the images she carries with her in a suitcase. I'm going to play some documentation from the Brussels Walk, and that will be ending my presentation. Thank you.
Very much, Michelle. The jury was really taken with Michelle's work, not only for its use of wireless technology and an exploration of the ubiquity of surveillance in contemporary urban settings, but also for the critique and exploration of looking at public and private spaces. So thanks very much, Michelle. And I think everybody should have a look at the documentation downstairs now. Our third speaker for this first session this afternoon is Usman Haque, who will talk about his project that was presented at the opening event on Thursday night here. Usman.
Thank you. I'm going to talk kind of standing up because I get really fidgety when I'm sitting down. If you don't mind, I'm going to walk around a little bit. I'm going to talk about electromagnetic fields which surround us. They exist everywhere. They're natural. There are electromagnetic waves coming in from outer space, from elements here on Earth. Even biologically, we produce electromagnetism. But it's only in the last few decades that we've actually begun to contribute to this cacophony with our pagers, our mobile phones, our garage door openers. And we're intruding on something that industrial design theorist Tony Dunn calls Hertzian space. Now, this was a space that's very interesting to me with my architectural background because it conditions the way we move through space in much the same way that traditional architectural elements do. I actually first started to think about this project when I was in my studio in Japan, and I always found that I had to go to one particular part of the room to make a mobile phone call. And I realized that if I used the you know how on mobile phones you have the signal level, the bars? You can actually plot out what I call the invisible topographies of this Hertzian space and actually make a map of electromagnetic space, which again is physical, but which is just beyond the senses, our natural senses. Now, after a sort of bit of design process, started thinking that actually what I really wanted to do was be able to have a collection of sensors spread out over quite a large space that would be responding individually to the local conditions. And I thought of this as quite a sort of rigid thing that would actually stretch across a field. Fast forwarding about 3 or 4 years and lots of different design iterations, I actually began to envisage this more as a sort of performance piece where this, rather than just having a static field of sensors, that I would make something that would actually rise up into the sky so that you could create a three-dimensional view of what this electromagnetic space might look like. Now, at the same time, I began thinking about how if you made this sort of cloud thing that would rise up into the sky responding to the electromagnetic fields, if you embedded that cloud with mobile phones, then you can actually not only look at the electromagnetic fields that are present already, but you can contribute to them by calling into these mobile phones and creating even more electromagnetic fields. At the same time, I was also interested, again, from my architectural background, in somehow diminishing the distance between the designer and the user, or between the audience and the performer, thinking of this more as a sort of framework within which an audience could become the performer by making it come to life. Of course, this is quite an ambitious idea, I suppose, to make something about 30, 40 meters wide that would float up into the sky and would comprise something like 1,000 helium balloons and sensors. So I had to go through a number of structural experiments to get there. I borrowed a technique from the architect Gaudi. If you know his structures in Barcelona, he designed those often by hanging things upside down because gravity is symmetrical. And so all of these experiments here, which I'm showing, are just models where I'm beginning to try and understand how to fly this thing in the sky by hanging them upside down and then flipping the photographs. These are actually invaluable because later on, one of the crucial elements of the project was the technique of actually managing to control this thing once it was up in the sky, because calculations said that it would be up to something like 2 tons pulling on each cable. At this stage, I'm still looking at something with 6 cables. Later on, it came down to just 3 cables because that turned out to be a lot more manageable. And a little animation here that shows how it would float up. Now, the other side of this thing was to actually do the full-scale experiments to get there. As you can see, my very first experiment was a miserable failure. I only got up to a height of about 10 or 15 meters, and what I really wanted to do was get up to at least 60 meters, maybe even 100 meters. It looked kind of nice, and it looked a little bit like my models, but it didn't really go anywhere, so that was a bit of a problem. So I tried another version where I put balloons on the outside of this net and thought that extra large balloons would give it a bit more lift. But the crucial problem here was that if you understand, anytime there's wind blowing against something that's floating upwards, then the wind is always going to push it down in the same way that it sort of pivots from the ground point. So that wasn't working either. But fortunately, I was introduced to the professor of unsteady aerodynamics at Imperial College. And if there was ever a professor who was good for this project, that was him. After conversations with him, I developed basically this idea of a kind of a wing shape structure where the top surface was smooth from the smoothest of the top of the balloons, while the underside was rough with a very rigid edge. You can see here, this is a picture of a close-up of the carbon fiber tube that was actually going to go round this ring structure. And here I am starting to build it up. Because actually, although on the left you can see my test flight, where I did actually get up to about 60 meters there, on the right-hand side is the size that I actually wanted to do. Now, one of the problems with having 1,000 balloons to inflate is that by the time you have finished inflating the 1,000th balloon, then the first balloon has actually lost its buoyancy. Which is something I discovered after many experiments, looking at the loss rate of buoyancy, looking at, basically, if you can see these graphs, in the first 5 hours of inflation, after inflation, I've already lost 20% of the buoyancy. And when I'm dealing with microelectronics, I've got to carry the structure, I've got to carry the batteries, because of course every balloon is going to have a battery and 2 batteries inside. It's actually very crucial to think about how to design this. I had to find the absolute lightest materials I possibly could. I called everywhere from China to Australia, looking for nets, looking for valves, looking for LEDs, batteries, whatever I could find that was the lightest, so that I could actually make this structure. In the end, what I had to opt for was taking an off-the-shelf valve, which unfortunately didn't fit the extra large balloons that I wanted to use. So I had to, well, I'll show that to you in a second. While all this was going on, these sort of structural experiments, I had to do all of the electronics experiments. I think you can see on the bottom row, we've got the blue, red, and green. These are experiments just to see how much the balloon would act both as a buoyancy device, but also as a diffuser, a sort of light diffuser, to actually show the hopefully varying colors that I would get from the electromagnetic fields. And underneath, I'm testing just how bright those LEDs appear in an urban context. So that's just outside my flat, and you can see tiny balloon there, blue, red, and green, which is easily distinguishable. Fast forward a little bit, and developing some electronics here. At the top, you can see the first prototype, which shows some LEDs, and there's a coil underneath that, which is going to be picking up the electromagnetic fields through inductance. Of course, doing 1,000 of these, I had to mass produce the boards with various budgetary options you can see in the right-hand corner, because of course this is starting to get much more expensive than I'd really ever thought it would. Several telephone calls later to Texas Instruments and other sort of microcontroller producers, I finally figured out how to do it together under budget, and enlisted the help of some friends to start producing these boards. And of course, one of the crucial things to remember anytime you do something with 1,000 bits is make sure you get it right the first time, because if you make a mistake once, then you've got to fix it 1,000 times, which we had to do 5 times. So this is the final sensor and valve that was going to go into the balloons. You can see at the top is the electronics. We've got the LEDs, which are going to mix to create any one of thousands of colors. We've also got infrared, because of course one of the crucial things to do is figure out how to switch this thing on once it's inside a balloon. And so we decided to use just basically the same protocol that, that video remotes use. While we're doing this, we began to think, well actually, you know, if you're going to have these balloons responding to infrared, then why not have them communicate with each other? So we developed this thing which we called the B2B network, the balloon-to-balloon network, which allowed the balloons to communicate and actually coordinate and create larger patterns. At the bottom, you can see the vacuum-formed plastic bit that was added onto the valve to make it's large enough for the neck of the extra large balloons. Somehow I managed to convince the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich Park to host this event, which was kind of important for me because when I first did this project, I thought I would start on the line of Greenwich Mean Time and then sort of take it around the world, time zone by time zone. Unfortunately, it was such a masochistic exercise doing it once that I really never thought I'd do it quite so big again. So during the design process, as you saw in that drawing back there, it started off here at a manageable 22 meters, but it gradually grew. You know, normally these things don't actually grow bigger with budget, but somehow this actually became possible to do larger as I went along. And it became too large for the National Maritime Museum, so we went into their backyard, which is actually the park itself. And this was an early drawing. Here, now we're looking at triangle to triangle of about 35 meters, almost 34 meters there. Now, I had to borrow a little bit from mountain climbing techniques in order to figure out how to anchor this thing in the ground. This version didn't work, I should say. I don't have an updated drawing of what did work, but I had to figure out a way that people could control it to actually allow it to fly up, but also lock it in place so it didn't yank them off. In the end, I used a foot, which was actually 3 stakes, and I had 3 people at each of 3 points, so it actually took 9 people to fly. So this was launch day on September 15th. The version that you might have seen outside at the opening ceremony was just a very, very small one. The actual one is 12 times the size. The one at the opening ceremony had something like 80 or 90 balloons. This one has 1,000. And, well, it's got 37 rings instead of 3. So I'm just going to play a little bit video during our setup here. So you can see what happens is that we have this carbon fiber structure which is attached together. Now if I'm standing here, that's kind of full size now for you guys. No, that's a bit too small. All of the carbon fiber rings are stuck together, and you inflate the balloons from inside the net. One thing I forgot to mention is to explain why would anybody actually want to call into a cloud. The idea was that by calling into the cloud, you would hear these things called spherics and whistlers, which they're a natural form of electromagnetic frequency that you can actually pick up on your AM radio during a storm. They're almost like the audible equivalent of the aurora borealis or the northern lights, because they exist in the atmosphere. They're bouncing around, and you can listen to these very beautiful natural sounds, which you can hear now in the background, if I shut up. So the idea was that people were calling into this cloud to listen to these sounds, but they're also affecting the electromagnetic fields that they're listening to and looking at. Now sometimes you'll see the cloud flashing. That's when the various balloons are trying to coordinate. Other times it's a direct response. Here you see the phone numbers that are being projected on the ground in front of the performance, because of course there are about 37 phones up there, and what I wanted to do was actually sequence the phone numbers as they came in relation to the cloud as a whole. We got permission for about 60 meters from the Civil Aviation Authority, but actually on the night we managed to get up to 100 meters, which was kind of nice. Now finally, just to show you a slightly better picture of what it looked like, because the video is a little bit dark. These photographs, I think, show better the actual quality of the sort of visual side of it anyway. I'll just go through these pictures one by one. That gives you an idea of the sort of scale of the thing. That is the Royal Observatory. You can see in the background the laser of Greenwich Mean Time, which is there all the time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Usman. The jury was also intrigued by the kind of the visualization of something that's invisible, and we talked at great length about the accuracy of the visualizations that you were seeing and how one would be able to actually interpret your own calling into the cloud. So it was fantastic to hear you talk about that. Thank you very much. Now, if we could have a bit of light on the audience, and I'd like to field some questions. But I can't see anybody, so yeah. Yep.
Yeah, shall I use this?
No,
or you want to take that out and do it?
Yeah, I'm going to give that to the audience.
What I did was, because once all of the phone numbers are released, then it is a bit of a sort of jumbly mishmash. The idea being that I didn't want necessarily somebody to have this sort of individual experience of, oh, that's my ring. I would prefer to give the sensation that everyone was contributing to create the image as a whole. But at the beginning of the performance, the numbers were phased in, one by one. So for the first minute, there was only one phone number available. And so that was just for one ring. And then every minute, or maybe it was every 40 seconds or something, I phased in another number. So bits of the cloud started switching on. As it happened on the night, unfortunately somebody got hold of the phone numbers before they were publicly released, and there were parts of it that were lighting up out of order, as it were, because they were phoning a bit too early. But yeah, I wanted a little bit of both, I should say.
Thanks. There's actually two standard mics in the aisles if people want to approach the mics, or we have one roving mic here. And you can, of course, direct your questions to any of the artists, Michelle, Niklas, or Usman. Do we have any further questions? Okay.
That was easy.
That was easy. Thanks very much for listening. We're going to take a 5-minute break as we switch over to the next 3 artists. And I'd like to thank all of the artists for their fabulous presentations and talking about their work. Michelle, Usman, and Niklas. Thank you.